The bedsheets were soaked with tears. When ground crews entered the underground shelters at Chiron Air Base on the morning of April 6, 1945, after the pilots had already departed for their final missions, they found the evidence that propaganda had worked so hard to conceal. The thin mattresses were damp. The pillowcases stained. Young men had spent their last night on Earth weeping into their bedding, faces buried so their companions wouldn't hear. This discovery, documented by base personnel and later revealed by historians, shatters the image we've been sold for 80 years. The Kamikaze pilots were not screaming fanatics eager to die for the Emperor. They were terrified teenagers who spent their final hours crying for their mothers. But here's what makes this story even more troubling. Many of these young men never volunteered at all. The volunteer statistics were carefully manipulated. The choice, when it existed only in the narrowest technical sense. And what happened in those final hours reveals something profound about courage, coercion, and the vast distance between the myths nations tell and the truths they hide. Let me take you to Chiron Air Base, southern Kyushu, April 5th, 1945, 24 hours before those tears were shed. The war is already lost. Everyone knows it, though saying so aloud would bring swift punishment. Tomorrow, 355 aircraft will launch Kikusui No. 1, the first massive coordinated wave of suicide planes aimed at the American fleet surrounding Okinawa. Among those pilots is a young man whose story represents thousands. His real name might have been Kiyoshi, Isao, or Haruo. He might have been 19 or 23, or, and this detail should make you pause, as young as 16. Yes, 16. The youngest Kamikaze pilot, Yasuo Tanaka, was just 16 years old when he flew his Ohka rocket bomb into the ocean on May 11, 1945. On the other extreme, the oldest was Lieutenant Colonel Yoshio Itsui, age 32, who led the first wave from Chiron on April 1st, leaving behind a wife and 3 small children, including an infant son. But there's another pilot whose story complicates everything we think we know about Kamikaze. His name was Captain Masaji Takano. He was born in Hawaii, raised in America. He married a Japanese woman, went to Japan for university, and somehow ended up recruited for the Kamikaze Corps. His last letter includes a drawing of a diving plane with the words, "I will surely send an enemy warship to the bottom." Takano had 3 brothers, 1 who fought for Japan and 2 who fought for the US Army in Europe. An American kamikaze pilot attacking American ships. The complexity of identity, loyalty, and war crystallized in one person. Tonight, our composite pilot, let's call him Haruo, sits on his bunk with a pen in his hand, staring at blank paper. He's supposed to write his final letter home. The characters should flow easily. He's practiced this in his mind 1,000 times during the weeks of waiting. But now that the moment has arrived, the words won't come. Around him, other young men struggle with the same impossible task. Some smoke cigarettes, hands trembling. A few play with a puppy someone brought to the compound, finding brief refuge in simple animal joy. Photographs from these hours survive. If you look closely at the pilot's eyes, you see something the propaganda never captured. Not enthusiasm, not fanatical determination, just a hollow, distant look, as if they've already left their bodies, already made the mental journey from living person to Ere, the guardian spirit they've been promised they'll become after death. The question that should haunt anyone who learns this history is simple. How did they get here? How did Japan convince thousands of educated young men to fly loaded planes into enemy ships? The answer is more complex, more disturbing, and more human than simple stories of fanaticism allow. And it begins 6 months earlier, with a vice admiral who understood Japan had lost the war, but could not accept what that meant. The birth of the Divine Wind, October 1944. Mabalacat Airfield, the Philippines. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi stands before pilots from the 201st Air Group, about to propose something unprecedented in modern warfare. He's not offering a new strategy or clever tactic. He's asking these men to guarantee their own deaths. Japan's situation has moved beyond desperate. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 destroyed 4 fleet carriers and eliminated many of Japan's most skilled pilots. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, mockingly nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American aviators, wiped out hundreds more aircraft and aircrew in a single day. Now, in October 1944, Japan lacks both the ships and trained pilots to conduct conventional naval warfare. American submarines have severed supply lines from Southeast Asia. B-29 bombers based in the Marianas have begun striking the home islands. Cities are burning. The war is lost. Onishi knows this. Everyone in this room knows this. What he's about to propose isn't about victory. It's about changing the terms of defeat. He tells the pilots that one aircraft deliberately crashed into a ship will cause more damage than 10 conventional bombing runs. The mathematics are brutal, but straightforward. Japan cannot afford to waste planes and pilots in attacks that mostly miss their targets. Better to guarantee the hit, even if it costs the pilot's life. Better still, if such spectacular sacrifice might shock the Americans into negotiating, rather than demanding unconditional surrender. The official military records report what happened next. Every pilot volunteers. The accounts use phrases like frenzy of emotion and joy. This narrative has been repeated for 80 years. But if you examine letters written by pilots who were present, if you read the diaries of men who survived, a more nuanced picture emerges. These pilots understood that refusing meant bringing unbearable shame upon their families. In a military culture where superiors routinely beat subordinates, where the concept of individual choice had been systematically destroyed through years of militarization, where family honor transcended individual survival, what did volunteer actually mean? Some pilots genuinely believed in their mission. Others were simply asked to raise their hands, knowing that refusal was technically possible, but practically unthinkable. The word volunteer existed in a space between choice and compulsion that Westerners struggle to understand. Within hours, the first official kamikaze unit forms. They call it the Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the Divine Wind Special Attack Unit. The name reaches back 663 years to 1281, when typhoons destroyed Mongol invasion fleets attempting to reach Japan. Those storms were called Kamikaze, Divine Wind, interpreted as the god's intervention to save Japan. Now, in October 1944, military propagandists resurrect this ancient term. These young men, they proclaim, will be the new Divine Wind. They will save Japan as their ancestors were saved. The mythology begins immediately. But 15 days after that meeting at Mabalakot, when the first organized kamikaze attack actually flies, the human truth beneath the propaganda starts to emerge. The first mission, USS St. Lo, October 25th, 1944. Lieutenant Yukio Seki leads 5 fighters from Mabalakot toward the American fleet off Samar Island. Each plane carries a 250-kilogram bomb. Each has extra fuel tanks. None has ammunition for its guns. These are one-way flights. Seki is 23 years old, a graduate of the Japanese Naval Academy, a trained aviator with hundreds of hours of experience. Before takeoff, he tells a fellow officer something that contradicts every propaganda image. "I do not want to die." This statement, preserved in post-war testimony, is crucial. Seki understands his duty. He will follow orders. But he takes no joy in his impending death. His target area is the American escort carrier group designated Taffy 3. These small carriers and their escorts have just survived a surface battle against Admiral Kurita's powerful force: 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 12 destroyers. Through desperate courage and tactical brilliance, the tiny American force had turned back the massive Japanese fleet. The sailors aboard these ships think the worst is over. They are wrong. At 10:50 a.m., Seki's unit attacks. The escorts engage Japanese fighters, trying to protect the carriers, but several kamikaze planes break through. Seki likely aims for USS White Plains initially, but anti-aircraft fire damages his aircraft. He adjusts course toward USS St. Lo. At 10:51 a.m., his Zero crashes into St. Lo's flight deck. The bomb penetrates to the hangar deck, where aircraft are being refueled and rearmed. Gasoline ignites immediately. Secondary explosions follow, bombs detonating, torpedoes exploding, the ship's ammunition magazine erupting in a massive fireball. St. Lo is engulfed in flames. Within 30 minutes, she capsizes and sinks. Of 889 crew members, 113 are killed or missing. Another 30 die later from wounds. USS St. Lo becomes the first major warship in history sunk by a kamikaze attack. But this statistic obscures the human cost. Sailors who survived describe swimming through oil-slicked water, some of them burning from fuel fires that spread across the sea. Sharks attacked men in the water, drawn by blood and commotion. Survivors watched their shipmates torn apart. The psychological trauma from this new form of warfare, pilots deliberately killing themselves to kill you, proved devastating. Unlike conventional attacks where enemy pilots tried to survive, kamikaze attacks removed any possibility of deterrence through self-preservation instincts. When news of St. Lo's sinking reaches Japan, the propaganda machine springs into action. Seki is portrayed as a hero who eagerly embraced death for the emperor. The truth, that he explicitly stated he didn't want to die, is suppressed. More pilots are recruited, more units are formed. Within months, kamikaze operations expand from desperate experiment to official military policy. And the young men selected for these missions are, increasingly, not experienced aviators like Seki, but university students barely trained to fly. Who were they? The real kamikaze pilots. The propaganda image of the kamikaze pilot shows a fierce warrior, perhaps older, experienced, embodying samurai spirit and Bushido philosophy. The reality was almost the opposite. Most kamikaze pilots were very young, between 18 and 24 years old. The majority were not experienced military aviators, but university students, or recent graduates, hastily trained and thrust into combat with minimal preparation. Military records show that of the 782 naval kamikaze officer pilots who died, 685 were former university students. Only 12% were professional military pilots. At the Battle of Okinawa, the disproportion grew even more extreme. 82% of naval kamikaze deaths involved student soldiers. These young men came from Japan's educated elite. They studied engineering at Waseda University, literature at Rikyo, science, law, philosophy. They read Kant, Rousseau, Marx. They wrote poetry. They debated politics and dreamed about the future. Under different circumstances, they might have become teachers, doctors, businessmen, artists, leaders who would rebuild Japan after the war. Some had girlfriends, fiancés, young wives. A few had children they would never watch grow up. They were, in other words, ordinary young men, caught in the machinery of war and imperial ideology. The selection process reveals how carefully the system was designed to extract maximum sacrifice while preserving some elements of social structure. Traditional Japanese culture placed special responsibility on firstborn sons to continue the family line and care for aging parents. Military policy generally protected firstborns from kamikaze service, not out of compassion, but to ensure family systems survived. Second sons, third sons, men without such obligations became the primary recruits. Paul Saniyaki Nakamura, who survived the war and later became an Anglican bishop, described in interviews how he volunteered as a second son. understanding his older brother needed to survive to maintain the family. This practice reveals the cold calculation beneath rhetoric about total sacrifice. Even while demanding thousands of young men kill themselves, the military carefully preserved traditional social hierarchies. The training they received was shockingly inadequate. At the beginning of World War II, Japan estimated combat pilots needed 500 hours of flight experience. In 1941, Japanese naval pilots averaged 700 hours, Army pilots 500. By 1944, those numbers had dropped to 300 and 200 hours respectively due to fuel shortages and time pressure. Kamikaze pilots, designated for one-way missions, received only 40 to 50 hours total, approximately 7 days of instruction, according to National Archives records. 7 days. 7 days to learn skills that would determine whether you successfully hit your target or died uselessly in the ocean. The training progression reveals priorities. First few days learning to take off. Next few days practicing formation flying. Final days studying how to attack targets. Landing, navigation, aerial combat. These skills were deemed unnecessary for men who wouldn't return. Some pilots learned in actual aircraft. Others, as fuel grew scarce, used gliders and had to imagine the instruments of real planes. One survivor recalled, "What was provided was a glider, with trainees forced to use their imagination for the instruments. After all, no skills were required except for flying straight." This inadequacy had predictable consequences. Kamikaze units flew with escorts, experienced pilots and conventional fighters who navigated to target areas, protected the suicide planes from Allied interceptors, and returned to report results. Without escorts, many kamikaze pilots would never have found their targets. Even with escorts, pilots frequently became separated and simply vanished into the Pacific. The actual success rate, according to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, was devastating in its futility. Only 18.6% of kamikaze missions resulted in hits or damaging near misses. More than 80% either missed their targets, were shot down by Allied fighters or anti-aircraft fire, or failed to reach the battle area at all. For every pilot who hit a ship, 4 or 5 died without accomplishing anything militarily significant. The program consumed Japan's next generation for marginal tactical gain. But statistics don't capture what it felt like to be selected. To know you would die. To wait days, weeks, sometimes months for orders. To watch friends take off and never return, knowing your turn was coming. The culture of death. Understanding Bushido. To understand how thousands of young men accepted or were coerced into kamikaze service, we must examine the cultural and ideological foundations that made such a program possible. At the center lies Bushido, the way of the warrior, but not the historical samurai code. Something different, something modern and manufactured. Here's a revelation that reshapes everything. Bushido, as most people understand it, as a coherent ancient code that governed samurai warriors for centuries, largely didn't exist before the late 19th century. Samurai followed various customs and codes, certainly, but the term Bushido and its specific principles were formalized during the Meiji Restoration period after 1868, when Japan rapidly modernized and sought to forge unified national identity. The key text was Bushido, the Soul of Japan, published in 1900 by Inazo Nitobe, an educator writing in English for Western audiences. Nitobe presented Bushido as Japan's equivalent to European chivalry, a noble code emphasizing virtue, loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. His romantic interpretation influenced how both Westerners and Japanese understood samurai culture. It became tremendously popular. It was also historical fiction, idealizing a past that never quite existed in the form he described. During the 1930s and 1940s, as militarism dominated Japanese politics, state propagandists, weaponized Nitobe's invention. They transformed this reimagined Bushido into an ideology of total loyalty to emperor and nation. The 1890 Imperial Rescript on Education required students to ritually pledge to die courageously for the state. This reinterpreted Bushido redirected samurai loyalty from feudal lords to the emperor, conflating obedience to military orders with ancient warrior honor. Another influential text was Hagakure, written in the early 18th century but not widely published until the 20th century. It contains the famous line that the way of the samurai is found in death, that a warrior should live as though already dead. Military authorities seized on this extreme interpretation, distributing pocket editions to soldiers in the 1940s. But context matters. Hagakure's author wrote decades after samurai had shifted from battlefield warriors to bureaucrats during the peaceful Tokugawa period. His emphasis on death was partly nostalgia for a martial past that no longer existed. Militarists cherry-picked passages supporting their agenda while ignoring context. State Shinto provided the spiritual justification. Japan's indigenous religion, Shinto, centers on reverence for kami, spirits associated with nature, ancestors, sacred places. During the Meiji period and through World War II, the government transformed Shinto into state ideology, emphasizing emperor worship. The emperor was portrayed as a living god, descended in unbroken line from sun goddess Amaterasu. Disobeying the emperor became equivalent to defying the gods themselves. The promise of enshrinement at Yasukuni Shrine offered spiritual compensation for death. Yasukuni, established in 1869, honors Japan's war dead as kami. To die in imperial service and be enshrined at Yasukuni meant becoming a divine guardian spirit. The emperor visited Yasukuni twice yearly to pay homage. For young men raised in this ideology, the promise of such honor could outweigh, or at least provide framework for accepting, their own annihilation. The culture of shame reinforced everything. In Japanese social structure, bringing shame on one's family was considered worse than death. This fear was instilled from childhood through families and schools. Refusing kamikaze assignment would shame not only the pilot, but his entire family. Parents, siblings, extended relatives facing social consequences. Conversely, dying honorably would bring glory to the family name. Filial piety added another layer of pressure. The Confucian obligation to honor and obey parents appeared constantly in final letters. Pilots framed their deaths as repaying parents for raising them. One wrote, "I, as an imperial subject, surely am about to show in a single act both loyalty to the emperor and filial piety to you." The formulation links imperial service directly to family duty, making kamikaze missions a way of honoring parents even as it guarantees their grief. But here's what all this cultural context obscures: individual human beings grappling with the prospect of their own deaths. Not all pilots accepted the ideology they were fed. Letters revealed doubt, fear, resistance beneath required expressions of loyalty. One surviving pilot later said that the moment he sat down to write his final letter, that's when it became real. That's when I truly understood I was going to die. The cultural frameworks provided language for accepting death, but they didn't eliminate the terror of actually facing it. Daily life. While waiting, Chiron and other bases. The bases from which kamikaze pilots flew became their final homes. Places of contradictions, where military discipline coexisted with surprising humanity. Where young men prepared to die while desperately grasping at life. Chiron Air Base in southern Kyushu became the most famous of these locations. Situated in a rural area known for tea farming, the landscape was beautiful. Green mountains rising behind fields. The air carrying scents of vegetation alongside aviation fuel. The base consisted of runways, hangars, operations buildings, and residential barracks. Many pilots lived in semi-underground shelters designed to protect against American air raids. These shelters were dank and uncomfortable, but they provided safety and community. Daily routine followed strict military discipline. Pilots woke early for exercises and inspection. Breakfast was communal when supplies allowed. Rice, pickles, miso soup, though rations decreased as supply lines weakened. Mornings involved continued training, aircraft maintenance, or military instruction. Afternoons were spent studying, reading, writing letters, exercising. But alongside military structure existed unexpected humanity. Local families, particularly those near Chiron, formed relationships with pilots. The most famous was Tome Torihama, who ran the Tomiya Inn in Chiron town. Young pilots frequented her establishment, seeking refuge from base life. Torihama treated them with maternal warmth, feeding them, listening to their concerns, serving as confidant. Many pilots trusted her with final letters they wanted delivered to families, messages that might not pass through military censors. Torihama preserved these letters, artifacts, and memories for decades, eventually establishing a small museum. Her great-grandson, Kenta Torihama, now runs a restaurant near the Chiron Peace Museum and shares stories about his great-grandmother's relationship with the Kamikaze pilots. He emphasizes remembering these young men as individuals, not just symbols or statistics. High school girls from Chiron were sometimes brought to see pilots off, waving branches of cherry blossoms as planes took off. These girls, teenagers themselves, formed connections with pilots not much older. Some became pen pals, exchanging hundreds of letters. Masao Kanai exchanged 200 letters with 17-year-old Toshi Negishi. They attempted one date in Tokyo, but it occurred on March 10, 1945, during the massive firebombing that killed perhaps 100,000 people. Kanai died in a kamikaze mission near Okinawa at age 23. Negishi kept their letters and a crystal pendant with their initials for 70 years before donating them to a memorial. The waiting between training and mission assignment was psychologically excruciating. Pilots never knew when orders would come. Days stretched into weeks, sometimes months. This uncertainty created a strange liminal state. Already dead in a sense, their fates sealed, yet still alive, experiencing all normal human needs and emotions. Some tried to live with what one called 120% intensity, cramming as much experience as possible into remaining time. Others retreated inward, becoming quiet and withdrawn. Reading provided escape, philosophy, literature, poetry, anything available. Some wrote in journals, though authorities discouraged personal writings that might reveal doubts undermining morale. A few pilots brought books on their final missions. One flew carrying 2 volumes of George Sand's Les Maîtres Sonneurs in his pockets. What comfort did French literature provide in those final hours? Perhaps simply connection to a world beyond war, a reminder that beauty and human creativity existed. Relationships between pilots were complex. They were comrades facing the same fate, creating intense bonds. Yet each man faced his death alone. Some formed particularly close friendships. Others remained somewhat apart, dealing with fear privately. Photographs from waiting periods show remarkable variety. In some images, pilots smile at cameras, arms around each other, appearing almost carefree. In others, faces are solemn, eyes distant. One famous photograph shows pilots playing with a puppy the day before a mission. 5 young men aged 17 to 19, all young boy pilots who had joined training corps at age 14, none knowing they'd become kamikaze. The contrast between their youth, the playful puppy, and knowledge of what awaited them next morning is almost unbearable. All 5 died on May 27, 1945. As orders approached, pilots received special items. The senembari, belt of 1,000 stitches, came from mothers or women in families. Tradition held that 1,000 women each contributed a stitch, creating a protective talisman. The belt was meant to ensure safe return, though for kamikaze missions, safe return meant successful impact, not survival. The hachimaki, white headband with rising sun, became kamikaze pilots' most recognizable symbol. Pilots also carried personal items, photographs, letters, small mementos. Items were supposed to be minimal, leaving weight for bombs and fuel. But pilots found ways to bring fragments of their lives into death. The night before missions, activity intensified. Aircraft were prepared, fueled, loaded with bombs. Engineers checked systems, though landing gear was often designed to drop after takeoff and be reused. Grim efficiency measure. Pilots attended final briefings, receiving maps, target information, instructions. Aim for aircraft carriers if possible. Otherwise, battleships. Otherwise, any large vessel. Keep your eyes open during the final dive. After briefings, some tried to sleep. Most couldn't. They sat awake, smoking, talking quietly, or staring into darkness. Some wrote additional letters or poems. Others prayed at small shrines on base. A few wept privately, away from others, because showing fear brought shame. And this is where we return to those soaked bedsheets discovered by ground crews. The physical evidence of what official records denied, that these young men spent their final hours crying, terrified, human. The last letters, voices from the edge. The letters written by kamikaze pilots in their final hours provide the most direct window into their thoughts and feelings. Thousands have been preserved in museums and private collections. They reveal emotions that often contradict propaganda. Young men torn between duty and desire, between roles they were expected to perform and authentic human feelings they struggled to express. Writing final letters was official military policy, ensuring families received closure. But letters were subject to censorship. Military authorities screened them for anything undermining morale or revealing secrets. Pilots' new superiors would read their words before families received them. This knowledge constrained what they could write, forcing them to perform loyalty and acceptance even in their most personal communications. Yet within constraints, genuine feeling emerges. The most common theme is apology to parents. Pilot after pilot expresses shame for having been an inadequate son, for causing worry, for failing to fulfill filial obligations. These apologies suggest deep guilt about pain their deaths would cause families, even while framing that pain as necessary sacrifice. Flight Petty Officer 2nd Class Nobutaka Inoue, age 18, wrote on April 27, 1945, the day before his mission, "I sincerely thank you for taking care of me until this, my 18th year. I also at last have joined the Special Attack Corps, an airman's highest honor, and it has been decided that I will make a sortie." The formality of language, reference to honor, assertion of pride. These elements reflect required performance. But underlying message is simpler and devastating. I am 18 years old, and tomorrow I will die, and I want you to know I love you. Many letters mention mundane details that seem jarring in context of impending death. One pilot mentions a bar of soap. "The made in Manila bar of toilet soap you'll find in my things was given to me by the Chief of Staff." The specificity grounds the letter in ordinary life, perhaps providing brief escape from extraordinary reality. Letters to wives and sweethearts reveal the most pain. Second Lieutenant Masashi Ohira wrote to his wife Fukuko before his mission in April 1945. "To me, you were a wife who was superior. You were a wife who was too good for me. At the end, I am thankful. I did not know a woman except for you." The tenderness here breaks through military formality. Ohira's desire to ensure his wife knows how much she meant creates poignancy that survives across decades and translations. Letters to children are especially heartbreaking. Lieutenant Ichizo Hayashi wrote to his daughter Motoko, "I want to see you grow up to be a splendid bride, but even if I die without your knowing me, you must not grieve. When you get older and want to see me, come to Kudan and pray with all your heart, and my face will appear before you. The reference to Kudan is significant. Yasukuni Shrine's location. Hayashi tells his daughter that after death, he'll be enshrined as Kami, and she can visit him there. Whether he believed this literally or was trying to provide comfort to a daughter who'd never remember him, we cannot know. But the attempt to maintain connection beyond death reveals his love and agony of leaving her. Some letters mentioned pregnancy or unborn children. These men died without knowing if wives gave birth to sons or daughters, without seeing children's faces. The loss was compounded. Pilot's death, plus child growing up without a father, wife raising that child alone. Alongside letters, pilots composed death poems, jisei, following samurai tradition. These poems, written in formal Japanese poetic forms, dealt with themes of death, honor, sacrifice, sometimes nature. They were meant to express Pilot's final thoughts and demonstrate spiritual readiness for death. Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa, who crashed into USS Bunker Hill on May 11, 1945, killing 393 American sailors, wrote, "It has been decided that I also will make a sortie as a proud Special Attack Corps member. Beyond those boundless white clouds, I will make my attack with a calm feeling. Not even thoughts of life and death will come to mind." The language performs expected loyalty perfectly, but the very first sentence reveals he had no choice. It has been decided. Passive construction obscures who decided, but clearly it wasn't Ogawa himself. Someone decided he would die, and now he must find meaning in it. Not all letters conformed to expectations. Some revealed questioning. Second Lieutenant Uehara wrote, "Tomorrow, one believer in democracy will leave this world." The reference to democracy is striking and puzzling. Was he suggesting his death was meaningless, conflicting with democratic values, or claiming that dying for a democratic future Japan justified the sacrifice? The ambiguity may have been intentional, coded message passing through censorship. What letters reveal collectively is young men desperately trying to make their deaths meaningful, to find framework transforming fear and grief into purpose. They draw on every resource: family love, national pride, religious belief, warrior tradition, creating narratives allowing them to face what they must face. Some succeed better than others. Some letters radiate genuine conviction. Others barely concealed terror beneath required formalities. The letters were delivered to families after pilots' deaths. For parents receiving these final messages, the words must have been both precious and devastating. Evidence sons had loved them, and evidence those sons were gone forever. Families preserved letters carefully, often for decades before donating to museums or allowing publication. The final ceremony. Mizu no sakazuki. The night passes slowly. Dawn arrives with that peculiar blue light, the color of distance and endings. April 6th, 1945. Kikusui number 1. The pilots gather for the final ritual before death. Mizu no sakazuki, the water ceremony, though it could involve sake instead of water. This was formal Shinto ritual adapted from Yakuza and traditional samurai practices, creating spiritual bond between participants and symbolizing commitment transcending life. For Kamikaze pilots, it served as final act of purification and spiritual preparation for transformation from living pilot to divine ere. The ceremony takes place outdoors when weather permits, often near the aircraft. Participants form lines facing superior officers. An altar is constructed with Shinto religious items, sacred sake containers, salt for purification, sometimes images or symbols representing kami. The atmosphere is intensely formal, every movement and word prescribed by tradition and military protocol. A commander or religious officer begins with formal proclamation in traditional Japanese. The language is archaic, drawing on centuries of warrior ritual. The proclamation explains the sacred nature of the mission, invokes divine protection of Kami, reminds pilots of duty to emperor and nation, promises their spirits will be honored at Yasukuni Shrine after death. Then, sake or water is poured into ceremonial cups, often decorated with cherry blossom motifs or other symbolic decorations. Cherry blossoms hold particular significance in Kamikaze symbolism, representing beauty and transience, the aesthetic philosophy that life is most beautiful when brief and intense, like blossoms that bloom brilliantly then fall. This philosophy, drawn from Japanese literary traditions, was weaponized by militarists to make early death seem poetic rather than tragic. The ranking officer drinks first, then passes the cup to pilots. Each takes a small sip, sometimes sharing a single cup among several men, other times receiving individual cups. The sharing creates bond, transforming the group into family, brothers united in fate. After drinking, pilots might make brief statements or simply bow. Some ceremonies involved shouting "Banzai" 3 times, 10,000 years, long life, paradoxically invoked by men about to die. Military propagandists photographed and filmed the ceremonies. These images show young men in flight suits and headbands, holding cups, surrounded by officers and ground crew. Pilots' expressions vary. Some appear calm, almost serene. Others look tense, anxious. A few smile for cameras, maintaining performance of enthusiasm. But if you look closely at their eyes, you often see something else. Fear, resignation, sometimes hollow distance. Alongside sake ceremony, pilots receive military decorations. Medals are pinned to uniforms. Awards for bravery the pilots will never actually wear. These decorations are sent to families after pilots' deaths, tangible symbols of honor that might provide comfort to grieving parents. Commanders give brief speeches praising pilots' courage, invoking emperor's gratitude, reminding everyone of mission's sacred importance. These speeches follow formula, mixing military rhetoric with spiritual language, emphasizing honor, duty, sacrifice. For pilots listening, the words may provide framework for understanding what they're about to do, or they may be simply noise that cannot reach the terrified place inside them. After ceremony concludes, pilots proceed to their aircraft. The walk takes only minutes, but marks a transition. They're no longer preparing to die. They're actively moving toward death. Ground crews stand by aircraft, having worked through the night. These ground crews have relationships with pilots, trained with them, eaten with them, lived alongside them for weeks or months. Now, they help pilots into cockpits, check harnesses and equipment, offer final words of encouragement or farewell. Some ground crew members openly weep. Others maintain professional composure. All know they're sending these young men to die. Pilots settle into cockpits. The cockpit of a Zero fighter is cramped, designed for a single occupant. Once the canopy closes, the pilot is sealed in, alone. Around him are instruments, controls, bomb release mechanism, rudder pedals, stick. Everything needed to fly to Okinawa and crash into an American ship. Nothing needed to return. Engines start one by one. Roar of rotary engines filling morning air. Pilots go through pre-flight checks, testing controls, checking fuel gauges, verifying bombs are armed. The checks are thorough despite one-way nature of mission. Professional training takes over, giving pilots tasks to focus on, procedures to follow, momentarily displacing terror. The command comes. Prepare for takeoff. Pilots adjust headbands, check harnesses are secure, grip control stick. The first aircraft begins to taxi. One by one, planes roll down runway, engines roaring. One by one, they lift into that brilliant morning sky. Some accounts describe pilots waving from cockpits as they take off. Others mention pilots looking straight ahead, not glancing at people below. A few records mention pilots circling back over base once, final farewell, before heading out to sea. And then they're gone. Silver aircraft disappearing into blue. Ground crews, commanders, high school girls who came to wave goodbye, all standing in silence, watching empty sky. The journey and the attack. Once airborne, kamikaze pilots enter a different world. Engine noise, aircraft vibration, wind streaming past canopy create cocoon separating them from everything they've known. Below, Kyushu's landscape falls away. Green mountains, rice fields, coastline where Japan meets the sea. Pilots fly in formation with escorts, experienced aviators and regular fighters who will protect them from American interceptors and lead them to target area. These escorts represent what kamikaze pilots had been before designation. Trained military pilots expected to fight and survive, to return from missions, to fly again. The contrast must be bitter. The flight south toward Okinawa takes hours. What do pilots think about during this time? A few who survived, who turned back due to mechanical problems or inability to locate targets, later described the experience. Some reported strange calmness during the flight. Terror of previous night and morning gave way to numb acceptance. The decision had been made. They were committed. Fighting fate was pointless. This psychological state, sometimes described in Buddhist terms as letting go of attachment, may have made final hours more bearable. Others reported thinking constantly about family, going through memories, replaying moments from childhood, time spent with parents, siblings. They thought about people they loved and would never see again. Some later said they spent the flight mentally writing letters they'd never get to send, trying to capture everything they wanted to say. A few reported anger, at the war, at decisions that led to this mission, at waste of their lives. But anger gave way to other feelings. Sadness, resignation, sometimes surreal detachment. Pilots carried the Kamikaze Operations Manual, providing specific instructions for final attack. The manual emphasized remaining calm, choosing largest possible target, diving at maximum speed from high altitude, aiming for flight deck or bridge of ships, and crucially, keeping eyes open until impact. The manual even addressed possibility of turning back, stating pilots should not waste lives if they couldn't locate targets. However, turning back carried enormous shame. Few pilots did so unless mechanical problems forced the issue. As they approach Okinawa, reality of what they're about to do becomes overwhelming. They can see the American fleet, hundreds of ships spread across miles of ocean. The sight is both terrifying and awe-inspiring. This vast armada representing American industrial might. Their single aircraft, loaded with a bomb, seems impossibly small against that fleet. Allied defenses are formidable. Combat air patrols of American fighter planes constantly circle the fleet. Radar picket stations, destroyers positioned around fleet perimeter, detect approaching planes and radio warnings. As kamikaze formations approach, American fighters scramble to intercept. Escorts engage these fighters, trying to protect suicide planes long enough for them to reach targets. Aerial combat erupts. Many kamikaze aircraft are shot down before reaching the fleet. American pilots flying F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs have orders to destroy incoming kamikazes at all costs. They succeed more often than not. Remember that statistic. Only 18.6% of kamikaze missions result in hits or damaging near misses. More than 80% are intercepted by fighters, destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, or fail to reach battle area at all. For pilots who make it through fighter screen, anti-aircraft fire from fleet creates another gauntlet. Americans developed specific tactics for defending against kamikaze attacks. Ships position themselves to provide overlapping fields of fire. Rapid-fire guns like 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon fire thousands of rounds per minute, filling sky with lead. Larger guns fire explosive shells detonating at specific altitudes, creating kill zones planes must fly through. The sky becomes a wall of fire and explosions. Pilots who survive this far have only seconds left. Instructions are to dive at maximum speed from high altitude. Some begin from 10,000 feet or higher. Acceleration is extreme, plane shaking violently as it exceeds normal speed limits. Target ship grows larger with terrifying speed. Gunfire from ship itself, directed specifically at diving aircraft, creates final desperate defense. The pilot's task is to aim, keep control, despite speed and fear, and above all, keep eyes open. To watch as ship fills vision, to see faces of sailors on deck looking up, to watch right until instant of impact. Closing eyes, even reflexively, might mean missing target, dying without accomplishing mission. Impact. Explosion. Bomb detonates. Aircraft fuel ignites. Plane and pilot disintegrate instantly. If hit is successful, explosion tears through ship's deck, possibly igniting fuel or ammunition stores, causing secondary explosions, fires, massive casualties. If hit is unsuccessful, pilot misses or strikes non-vital area. Damage might be limited, ship able to continue after repairs. But for pilot, success or failure makes no difference. He is gone. Transformed in a fraction of a second from person with hopes, fears, memories, relationships, into burning debris falling into ocean. His body is never recovered. His family receives notification. Your son, your husband, your brother is dead. Killed in action for emperor and nation. His name will be enshrined at Yasukuni. His death will be honored. This must be enough. Battle of Okinawa. The Kamikaze's peak and futility. The Battle of Okinawa, April through June 1945, represented the largest sustained kamikaze operation of the Pacific War. The statistics are staggering. Japan launched approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties during the 3-month campaign. American forces suffered 4,907 naval personnel killed and 4,174 wounded, primarily from kamikaze attacks, the Navy's dead exceeding its wounded, an unusual ratio explained by nature of suicide attacks. The explosions caused catastrophic casualties, leaving victims either unharmed or dead, with fewer survivable injuries. 36 ships sank, another 368 damaged, most by kamikazes. Affected vessels included destroyers, destroyer escorts, battleships, aircraft carriers. No ship larger than escort carrier completely sank, but several large carriers suffered devastating damage. USS Bunker Hill, hit by 2 kamikazes within 30 seconds on May 11th, suffered 393 dead and 264 wounded. The carrier was disabled for the war's remainder. The kamikaze attacks at Okinawa were organized into 10 large-scale coordinated strikes called kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. Each involved hundreds of aircraft launched simultaneously from bases across Kyushu. The first kikusui on April 6, 1945, involved 355 kamikaze aircraft and 344 escort fighters. The attack began at 3 p.m., lasted 5 hours. 22 kamikazes penetrated fighter screen and anti-aircraft fire, sinking 6 ships, damaging 18 others. 350 American sailors died that single day. Radar picket destroyers positioned around Okinawa bore the brunt. These ships, stationed 50 to 75 miles from main fleet, provided early warning of incoming Japanese aircraft, but exposed positions made them vulnerable. Kamikaze pilots often struck picket ships rather than continuing to main fleet. USS Laffey, stationed at Radar Picket Station 1, survived 22 kamikaze attacks on April 12th. 9 aircraft were shot down by destroyers' guns, but 6 hit the ship. Amazingly, Laffey stayed afloat, was eventually repaired, returned to service in Korean War. Her survival was attributed to exceptional leadership and crew courage. Other picket ships weren't fortunate. USS Bush and USS Colhoun sank April 6th after multiple hits. USS Luce went down May 4th when a bomb exploded beside her, tearing hull, followed immediately by kamikaze crash igniting ammunition magazine. She sank in 5 minutes with 149 men lost. Survivors in water faced shark attacks, adding natural horror to man-made catastrophe. The psychological impact on American sailors was severe. Navy personnel described kamikaze attacks causing more mental health casualties than any other combat. The stress of watching planes deliberately crash into ships, knowing pilots were intentionally killing themselves to kill you, created unique psychological trauma. Unlike conventional air attacks, where pilots tried to survive, kamikaze attacks removed any possibility of deterrence through self-preservation. You could wound a kamikaze pilot, see his plane burning, and he'd still complete his dive because completing the mission, not survival, was the goal. One account stated, "There was a hypnotic fascination to the sight, so alien to our Western philosophy. We watched each plunging kamikaze with the detached horror of one witnessing a terrible spectacle, rather than as the intended victim." This confusion about how to understand an enemy who sought death was widespread. American cultural and military traditions emphasize survival, skill, returning home to fight another day. Kamikazes represented something incomprehensible, warriors who measured success by dying effectively. This cultural gap made attacks seem more frightening, more alien, more disturbing than conventional warfare. From Japanese perspective, the kamikaze campaign at Okinawa was both final desperate attempt to alter war's outcome and strategic failure. Attacks caused significant damage, but didn't stop American advance. They didn't force negotiations or even significantly delay Okinawa's capture. What they accomplished was death of thousands of young Japanese men in a cause already lost. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who commanded 5th Air Fleet during Okinawa campaign, understood futility, but continued ordering attacks until war's end. On August 15, 1945, hours after Emperor's surrender announcement, Ugaki led a final kamikaze mission against American forces. He died in that attack, choosing to share fate he'd assigned to thousands of pilots. The effectiveness of kamikaze tactics continues sparking historical debate. Some argue strategy inflicted significant casualties, demonstrated Japanese resistance's ferocity, potentially influenced American leaders' decisions to use atomic weapons rather than invade Japan. Reasoning goes that if kamikaze attacks cost this many lives at Okinawa, invasion of home islands with millions of kamikaze defenders would be catastrophic. Therefore, atomic bombs represented less costly alternative. Others contend kamikaze effectiveness was overstated by both sides. Japanese propaganda exaggerated ships sunk. American reports emphasized kamikaze casualties to justify subsequent strategic decisions. Actual effectiveness, measured by percentage of successful hits, was relatively low, 18.6%. For every pilot who hit a target, 4 or 5 died accomplishing nothing militarily significant. This poor success rate, combined with irreplaceable loss of trained pilots, made kamikaze tactics strategically questionable, even from purely military perspective. What remains undeniable is human cost. Approximately 3,800 Japanese pilots died in kamikaze operations during the war. Most were between 18 and 24 years old. Most were university students or recent graduates. They came from educated families, had promising futures, represented Japan's next generation of leaders, thinkers, creators. Their deaths were losses not just to families, but to Japanese society, removing people who might have contributed to post-war reconstruction. On American side, more than 7,000 sailors died from kamikaze attacks, thousands more wounded or psychologically scarred. These men were also young, also had families, also had futures war took from them. The Kamikaze program created widows, orphans, parents who buried children. Pain spread across families, communities, a generation marked by loss. The Battle of Okinawa ended June 22, 1945, with American victory. Okinawan civilians caught between armies suffered catastrophic casualties, possibly 150,000 deaths. The island was secured for use as staging base for planned invasion of Japan's home islands. But that invasion never came. Atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August led to surrender. Memory and legacy. The unresolved past. The memory of kamikaze pilots in Japan remains deeply contested 8 decades later. Different groups remember them differently, shaped by politics, family connections, beliefs about the war. This complexity makes any single narrative impossible. The Chirin Peace Museum in Kagoshima Prefecture preserves the largest kamikaze pilot artifact collection. The museum displays letters, death poems, photographs, uniforms, personal items from over 400 pilots who departed from Chiron and never returned. Walking through the museum, visitors encounter wall after wall of photographs. Young faces, often smiling, sometimes serious, each accompanied by name, age, university, date of death. 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 22-year-olds. The repetition of youth becomes overwhelming. The museum also displays restored aircraft and exhibits explaining kamikaze operations' military context. But letters are the collection's heart. Glass cases contain actual final letters in pilots' own hands. Japanese characters flowing across yellowed paper, words written knowing they'd be the last. Translations accompany originals, allowing non-Japanese visitors to understand content. Reading letter after letter, themes recur. Apologies, gratitude, love, acceptance, fear barely concealed beneath formal language. The Kanoya Air Base Museum, located on grounds of current Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force Base, offers different perspective. This museum emphasizes military history and strategic context, though it also displays pilot photographs and letters. The combination of active military base and historical museum creates complex space where commemoration and contemporary military culture intersect. Critics argue these museums glorify kamikaze attacks, promote nationalist sentiments by framing pilots as heroes without sufficient emphasis on programs' injustice. Supporters contend museums honor memory of young men who sacrificed lives, that criticizing museums dishonors those deaths. This debate reflects broader tensions in Japanese society about how to remember the war, what responsibility contemporary Japanese bear for wartime actions, how to balance honoring dead with acknowledging historical wrongs. Family members of kamikaze pilots often visit these museums, seeking connection to lost relatives. Some families never received loved ones' bodies, never had physical graves to tend. Museums serve as substitute graves, places where families can pay respects, leave flowers, pray for spirits of dead. Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo remains most controversial site associated with kamikaze memory. The shrine, established 1869, enshrines approximately 2.5 million Japanese war dead as kami. Among them are all kamikaze pilots who died in attacks. However, Yasukuni also enshrines convicted war criminals, including those executed after Tokyo trials. This combination makes visits to Yasukuni by Japanese political leaders extremely controversial, drawing protests from China, South Korea, other nations that suffered under Japanese imperialism. The debate over Yasukuni epitomizes larger challenge of commemorating kamikaze pilots. How can Japan honor sacrifice of young men who died without implicitly endorsing war they fought, or militarist ideology that sent them to die? Is it possible to mourn pilots as victims of militarism while simultaneously acknowledging their role as combatants in aggressive war? These questions have no easy answers and continue dividing Japanese society. Scholarly perspectives have evolved significantly over decades. Early post-war accounts tended toward extremes, either dismissing kamikaze pilots as brainwashed fanatics or romanticizing them as noble warriors embodying samurai ideals. More recent scholarship has complicated both narratives, revealing diversity of pilot motivations, gap between propaganda and reality, ways cultural and military pressures constrained individual choices. Professor Emiko Onuki-Tierney's research has been particularly influential, analyzing diaries and letters from student kamikaze pilots. She found many were actually quite cosmopolitan, educated in Western philosophy and literature, conflicted about their missions. Rather than embodying blind nationalism, these pilots often struggled with contradiction between their education, which taught critical thinking, and military service, which demanded unquestioning obedience. Some pilots explicitly wrote about reading Western philosophy, referencing Kant, Rousseau, other Enlightenment thinkers. They engaged with concepts of individual autonomy and rational thought, even as they prepared to sacrifice autonomy and lives to the state. This intellectual engagement complicates simplistic narratives about brainwashed fanatics. These were thoughtful young men grappling with profound moral and philosophical questions, trying to make sense of what was being asked of them. Contemporary Japanese responses to kamikaze history vary by generation and political orientation. Older generations who lived through war tend to emphasize pilots' sincerity and sacrifice. Younger generations are more likely to critique militarist system while feeling sympathy for individuals caught in it. Conservative politicians occasionally invoke kamikaze pilots in nationalist rhetoric, using their memory to promote traditional values or military pride. Progressive activists and scholars push back, arguing that truly honoring pilots requires acknowledging injustice of their deaths and ensuring such programs never happen again. International perspectives also vary. In United States and other allied nations, kamikaze pilots are often remembered primarily as enemies, dangerous combatants who killed thousands of sailors. Trauma experienced by American veterans who faced kamikaze attacks remains real and significant. Museums and memorials in America focus on American sacrifice and victory, with kamikaze attacks appearing as evidence of Japanese desperation and fanaticism. This perspective has validity, but is incomplete, missing human complexity of pilots themselves. In recent years, some efforts have been made toward more nuanced understanding. Documentary films like Wings of Defeat interview surviving kamikaze pilots, allowing them to share experiences in own words. These testimonies reveal diversity of pilot experiences and lasting trauma many survivors carry. Some express pride in service. Others describe profound grief and regret, not for themselves, but for friends who died. Most emphasize they were ordinary young men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The question of how to remember kamikaze pilots ultimately connects to larger questions about how societies remember war. Do we honor sacrifice, even in service of unjust causes? Do we condemn systems while mourning victims? Can we hold space for both individual courage and programs' horror? Different cultures, different generations, different individuals will answer these questions differently. What seems clear is simple. Narratives fail. Kamikaze pilots were neither mindless fanatics nor noble heroes. They were young men shaped by culture, coerced by circumstance, trying to find meaning in situation where meaning was hard to locate. They felt fear and duty, love and grief. They wrote letters to mothers, apologizing for being inadequate sons, even as they prepared to die for those mothers' sake. They carried volumes of French literature into cockpits, brought photographs of families, thought about home even as they flew toward oblivion. Perhaps most important legacy of kamikaze pilots is not any particular interpretation of their actions, but preservation of their voices through letters they left behind. These letters resist neat categorization. They show humans confronting death, grappling with impossible choices, trying to maintain dignity and connection in face of annihilation. Closing, the weight of those bedsheets. We return now to where we began, Chiron Air Base, April 6, 1945. Ground crews entering underground shelters after pilots have departed, finding bedsheets soaked with tears. This discovery matters because it reveals the lie at the heart of kamikaze mythology. These weren't fanatical warriors eager to die. They were terrified young men who cried themselves to sleep on their final night alive, then woke up and did what their culture, their military, their entire society demanded they do. Some flew because they believed in their mission. Others flew because refusal was unthinkable. Most flew for reasons somewhere in between, a complex mixture of duty, fear, shame, love, resignation, and the desperate human need to find meaning in suffering. In those final hours, they wrote letters to families. They participated in sake ceremonies. They climbed into cockpits, knowing they wouldn't return. They took off into that brilliant blue sky, that color of distance and endings. And most of them, more than 80%, died without hitting anything militarily significant. They simply vanished into the Pacific, their lives extinguished for marginal tactical gain in a war already lost. Approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died during World War II. Each one had a name, each had a face, each had a story. Kiyoshi, Isao, Haruo, Yasuo Tanaka, age 16. Lieutenant Colonel Yoshio Itsui, age 32, who left behind a wife and 3 small children, including an infant who died 4 months later when his mother, grief-stricken, could no longer produce milk. Captain Masaji Takano, born in Hawaii, with brothers fighting on both sides of the war. Each of them had parents who raised them, teachers who instructed them, friends who knew them. Each had dreams about the future, things they wanted to do, people they wanted to become. War took all of that and compressed it into a statistic, a number in a casualty report, a name on a memorial wall. Understanding kamikaze pilots requires holding contradictions in balance. They were victims of militarism, and they were combatants in an aggressive war. They acted with courage, and they had little choice. Their letters express genuine feeling, and they perform roles demanded by military authority. They deserve our respect as individuals, and we must critique the system that killed them. All these statements are true. None can be discarded without losing something essential. The final hours of a kamikaze pilot were not glorious. They were terrifying, sad, deeply human. Young men trying to write letters they couldn't finish. Young men crying into pillows so companions wouldn't hear. Young men petting puppies, smoking cigarettes with trembling hands, staring at photographs of families they'd never see again. And then, somehow, finding the strength to climb into cockpits and fly toward their deaths, carrying with them whatever fragments of meaning they could construct from the wreckage of their truncated lives. That's the story. Not the propaganda version, not the sanitized narrative of noble sacrifice. The human story. Messy, complicated, heartbreaking, and true. If you found this exploration meaningful, if it's helped you see past the myths to the humans beneath, consider subscribing to Sleepable History. We take time to unfold stories, to honor complexity, to treat historical figures as people rather than symbols. History doesn't move quickly. Understanding moves even more slowly. But in that slow movement, we find truth. Thank you for listening. Remember those tears. Remember those faces. Remember that they were us. Young people trying to survive impossible circumstances, trying to find meaning in suffering, trying to love and be loved, even as death approached. Rest well, and may we learn from their sacrifice what they were never allowed to know: that peace is worth more than honor, that life is worth more than glory, that the only divine wind worth invoking is the one that prevents war, not the one that perpetuates it. The survivors, those who returned. Not all kamikaze pilots died. This fact surprises many people who assume the program had a 100% fatality rate. In reality, approximately 25 to 33% of kamikaze flights returned to base. Mechanical problems, bad weather, inability to locate targets, fuel shortages. All these factors meant pilots sometimes came back. But returning brought its own torment. Yoshiomi Yanai, now 93, survived because he could not locate his target. A rare error for a kamikaze operation. He visits the Tsukuba facility often, decades after the war. "I feel so bad for all the others who died," he says, bemoaning the fate of comrades who died so young, never having really experienced life. Yanai still keeps what he intended to be his last message to his parents, an album carefully wrapped in a traditional furoshiki cloth. He plastered the pages with photos of himself laughing with colleagues and other happy moments. A pilot friend added ink drawings of the Zero fighter. On the opening pages, Yanai wrote, in big letters, "Father, Mother, I'm taking off now. I will die with a smile. I was not a filial son, but please forgive me. I will go first, and I will be waiting for you." But he didn't die. He returned. And he's carried that survival, that guilt, for nearly 80 years. Other survivors describe similar experiences. Some were relieved to survive, grateful for mechanical failures that saved their lives. Others felt intense shame, believing they'd failed their duty. Some were sent on multiple missions, each time prepared to die, each time returned by circumstances beyond their control. The psychological toll of repeated preparations for death, followed by survival, created unique trauma. Keiichi Kuwahara describes taking off on May 4th, 1945, heading for Okinawa, his mission clear, crash into an enemy warship. As he flew out to sea, he gazed back with tear-filled eyes toward Japan, the homeland he never expected to see again. "They didn't need to tell us what to do because we knew. It was simple. We had to get in a plane and crash into a target. I kept looking back, thinking it was the last time I would see the land." But engine problems forced him to turn back. He survived, returned to base, faced the shame of survival. Then, before he could be sent on another mission, the war ended. Like Yanai, Kuwahara has lived with complex feelings. Relief at survival, mixed with guilt about comrades who died. Questions about why he was spared when so many others weren't. Some survivors became vocal critics of the kamikaze program in post-war years. They described the coercion, the brutality of training, the manipulation of young men's patriotism and family loyalty. They emphasized that pilots were not fanatical volunteers, but ordinary young men trapped in a system that gave them no real choice. Others maintained that their willingness to sacrifice was genuine, that they believed in their mission, that their survival doesn't diminish the sincerity of their commitment. These survivors often visit Yasukuni Shrine, pay respects to fallen comrades, participate in memorial ceremonies. They see their survival not as fortune, but as burden. The responsibility to remember, to honor, to ensure those deaths are not forgotten. The diversity of survivor responses illustrates the complexity of kamikaze experience. There was no single kamikaze pilot type, no uniform motivation, no universal interpretation of what it meant to be selected for suicide missions. There were thousands of individual experiences, thousands of personal stories, thousands of different ways of making sense of an impossible situation. The Ohka, the ultimate suicide weapon. Among the various aircraft used for kamikaze attacks, one stands out for its pure, undiluted commitment to suicide. the Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka, nicknamed Baka, Fool, by American forces who encountered it. Work on the Ohka began in 1943, actually before the first organized kamikaze attacks. The idea came from Mitsuo Ota, a Japanese transport pilot. The concept was simple and horrifying. Create an aircraft specifically designed for suicide missions, a plane that could never land, that had no purpose except to crash into enemy ships. The Ohka was essentially a bomb with wings and a cockpit. It had no landing gear. It was powered by rocket engines that provided tremendous speed but burned out quickly. The pilot sat in a small cockpit, surrounded by 1,200 kilograms of explosives. Once launched from a mother aircraft, typically a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, at high altitude, the pilot would glide toward the target area, then ignite the rocket engines for a final supersonic dive into enemy ships. The Ohka pilot had no means of escape once the aircraft was fastened to the mother plane. This detail is important. Other kamikaze pilots, at least theoretically, had the option of bailing out or attempting to ditch in the ocean if they changed their minds or encountered insurmountable problems. Ohka pilots, once attached to the Betty bomber, were committed. There was literally no way out. The youngest kamikaze pilot, 16-year-old Yasuo Tanaka, died flying an Ohka on May 11, 1945. Try to imagine being 16, still in high school in most contexts, and climbing into a rocket-powered bomb, knowing there's no escape hatch, no emergency procedure, no possibility of survival. The aircraft itself is your coffin, designed from the beginning to be destroyed along with you. The Ohka program reveals the depths of desperation Japan reached in the war's final months. It wasn't enough to convince pilots to crash conventional planes into ships. The military designed and built aircraft specifically for the purpose of killing both the pilot and the target, aircraft that had no function other than suicide attack. American sailors called them Baka bombs, fool bombs. The name was derisive, mocking, an attempt to diminish the terror these weapons inspired. But the terror was real. An Ohka, in its final rocket-powered dive, traveled at nearly 600 miles per hour, too fast for anti-aircraft guns to track effectively. If one reached attack position, it was nearly impossible to stop. Fortunately for Allied forces, the Ohka program had significant weaknesses. The mother planes, the Betty bombers carrying Ohkas to launch position, were large, slow, and vulnerable to fighter attack. American fighters developed tactics specifically for intercepting these bombers before they could release their deadly cargo. Many Betty bombers were shot down with Ohka still attached, killing both the bomber crew and the suicide pilot who never got to launch. But some Ohkas did reach their targets. They struck with tremendous force, the combination of speed, rocket engines, and 1,200 kilograms of explosives, creating devastating impacts. Ships hit by Ohkas rarely survived. The job of overseeing and training Ohka pilots fell to specific commanders who had to live with the knowledge that everyone they trained was going to die. That the whole purpose of the training was to teach young men how to kill themselves effectively. Some of these commanders later expressed regret, describing the psychological burden of sending 18-year-olds, 16-year-olds to certain death. The American perspective, facing the divine wind. The kamikaze attacks created unique psychological challenges for American and Allied sailors. Unlike any previous form of warfare, kamikaze tactics meant facing an enemy who actively sought death, who considered successful self-destruction a victory. Traditional military thinking assumes self-preservation instincts. You can deter attacks by inflicting damage on enemy aircraft. If you hit an enemy plane, the pilot will typically break off the attack to attempt an emergency landing or bail out. But kamikaze pilots did the opposite. You could hit their planes, see them burning, see smoke pouring from engines, and they would continue their dives, using their last moments of control to ensure impact. Sailors describe the psychological impact as profound. One account states, "The first time you see a kamikaze attack, you don't quite believe it. You think the pilot will pull up at the last second. That survival instinct will kick in. But then the plane hits the ship, and you realize he actually did it. He actually killed himself on purpose. That realization is more frightening than the explosion." The attacks created constant anxiety. During daylight hours, radar operators searched for incoming aircraft. Lookouts scanned the skies. Every distant aircraft might be a kamikaze. The stress was unrelenting. Sleep was difficult. Nerves were raw. Battle fatigue rates at Okinawa reached unprecedented levels. According to Marine Corps Gazette accounts, more mental health issues arose from Okinawa than any other Pacific battle during World War II. The constant bombardment and high casualty rates, combined with the psychological impact of kamikaze attacks, broke many men psychologically. American sailors developed dark humor and coping mechanisms. They gave kamikaze pilots nicknames. They created superstitions and rituals meant to ward off attacks. They focused on the technical challenge of shooting down incoming planes, treating it as a problem to be solved, rather than confronting the human reality of young men deliberately killing themselves. But at night, in quiet moments, the reality was unavoidable. American sailors thought about the pilots in those planes. Some wondered what would drive someone to volunteer for certain death. Others assumed the pilots must be drugged or forced, unable to imagine anyone choosing such a fate. Few understood the complex cultural and coercive forces that produced kamikaze pilots. Some American sailors felt compassion for the pilots, recognizing them as young men caught in a terrible situation. Others felt only hatred, seeing them as fanatical enemies who deserved whatever fate befell them. Both responses were understandable. War creates conditions where empathy and hatred coexist, where recognizing enemy humanity conflicts with the necessity of killing them. The ships that survived kamikaze hits tell their own stories. USS Laffey, which survived 22 kamikaze attacks in 80 minutes, became famous as the ship that would not die. But that heroic nickname obscures the human cost. Sailors killed, wounded, burned, traumatized. The ship survived. Many of her crew didn't. Radar picket destroyers bore disproportionate casualties. These ships, stationed far from the main fleet to provide early warning, became kamikaze targets by virtue of their position. Of the 149 Allied ships hit or sunk by kamikazes during Okinawa, 88 were destroyers and destroyer types. Destroyer crews knew they were most likely targets. They faced each dawn knowing this might be the day a kamikaze found them. The psychological aftermath lasted decades. Veterans who experienced kamikaze attacks often suffered nightmares, anxiety, depression. The unique horror of watching planes deliberately crash into ships, of seeing pilots choose death to kill you, created trauma distinct from other combat experiences. Some veterans never spoke about it, carrying the memories in silence. Others shared their stories, trying to process experiences that seemed incomprehensible even decades later. The women left behind, widows and mothers. Behind every kamikaze pilot was a woman, mother, wife, sister, girlfriend, whose life was shattered by his death. These women's stories are often overlooked in kamikaze histories, but they represent another dimension of the program's human cost. Many pilots were married or engaged. Some had young children. Their wives faced not only grief, but practical hardship. In wartime and post-war Japan, women struggled to survive without husbands. Social stigma sometimes attached to war widows, especially those whose husbands had died in suicide attacks. Some women remarried, facing criticism for not honoring their husband's memory. Others remained alone, raising children in poverty, carrying grief for decades. One striking example is Mutsue Kogure, whose fiancé, 22-year-old Nobuaki Fujita, died in a kamikaze attack. A photograph shows Kogure in a bridal kimono, sitting with dozens of family members, grasping a framed picture of her dead fiancé, a post-mortem wedding where she married his photograph, becoming his widow without ever being his wife. She stares into the camera, expressionless. Fujita's last letter to her reads, "In my next life, and in my life after that, and in the one after that, please marry me. Mutsue. Goodbye. Mutsue. 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 The ever gentle, my dearest Mutsue." The repetition of her name, the desperation to be remembered, the promise of future lives together. The letter reveals a young man trying to make death meaningful to the woman he loved. Kogure never remarried. She remained devoted to Fujita's memory until her death in 1993, nearly 50 years after he died. Mothers experienced particular anguish. They had raised these boys, taught them to walk and talk, nursed them through childhood illnesses, watched them grow into young men. They received final letters expressing gratitude and apology. Then they received notification of death. Many mothers never recovered. Depression, suicide, and early death from grief were common among mothers who lost sons to kamikaze attacks. Lieutenant Colonel Yoshio Itsui's story illustrates the compounding tragedy. Itsui, age 32, was the oldest kamikaze pilot. He led the first wave from Chiron on April 1, 1945. He left behind a wife and 3 small children, including an infant son. His last letter to the infant, displayed at Chiron Museum, reads, "Work hard and please grow up to be an excellent Japanese man and son of the emperor." But the infant never read his father's letter. When Itsui's wife learned of his death, grief was so overwhelming she could no longer produce milk. The baby died of malnutrition 4 months later. One kamikaze death claimed 2 lives, father and son. Some women formed support networks, finding comfort in sharing experiences with other widows and mothers. These informal groups helped women process grief, provided practical support, and created spaces where expressing doubt about the war and its sacrifices was possible. In post-war years, some of these women became peace activists, using their experiences to argue against militarism. High school girls who waved goodbye to pilots also carried lasting impact. Toshi Nagishi, who exchanged 200 letters with pilot Masao Kanai, kept those letters and a crystal pendant with their initials for 70 years. She never married Kanai. They'd met only once, briefly, during the Tokyo firebombing. But his memory shaped her life. The decision to finally donate the letters and pendant to a memorial must have been difficult. Releasing physical connections to a young man who'd meant so much to her. The emotional labor of these women, processing grief, raising fatherless children, maintaining memories, participating in memorial ceremonies, represents another form of sacrifice demanded by the kamikaze program. Their stories remind us that each pilot's death rippled outward, affecting families, communities, and entire society marked by loss. Final reflection. The questions that remain. 80 years after the last kamikaze attack, fundamental questions remain unresolved. Were these pilots heroes or victims? Was their sacrifice meaningful or wasteful? Should we honor their memory or condemn the system that killed them? The answer, unsatisfying as it may be, is all of the above. They were heroes and victims. Their sacrifice was both meaningful to them personally and wasteful strategically. We should honor them as individuals and condemn the system. Simple binary choices fail to capture the complexity of human experience in extreme circumstances. What we can say with certainty is that the kamikaze program reveals what happens when nationalism, militarism, and cultural manipulation combine to override individual self-preservation instincts. The program shows how societies can create conditions where young people accept or are coerced into accepting their own deaths for causes determined by others. The bedsheets soaked with tears tell us that even within that system, even surrounded by ideology and coercion, human feeling persisted. Young men cried for their mothers. They grieved for the lives they wouldn't live. They felt fear, love, doubt, and despair. The propaganda tried to erase these feelings, to transform pilots into one-dimensional symbols of sacrifice and honor. But the tears, preserved in historical accounts and survivor testimonies, prove the propaganda was always a lie. Understanding kamikaze pilots requires holding space for complexity. It means recognizing that courage and coercion can coexist, that sincerity and manipulation aren't mutually exclusive, that victims can also be participants, that honoring individuals doesn't require celebrating the cause they died for. It means remembering that they were us, young people trying to navigate impossible circumstances, trying to find meaning in suffering, trying to love and be loved even as death approached. Their humanity, preserved in letters and photographs and tears, demands that we see them as more than historical abstractions, more than symbols in ideological debates, more than statistics in casualty reports. They were Kiyoshi and Isao and Haruo and Yasuo and thousands of others. Each one someone's son, someone's hope for the future. Each one gone. The divine wind that was supposed to save Japan instead consumed Japan's next generation, leaving behind widows, orphans, and parents who buried their children. May we learn from their sacrifice what they were never allowed to know, that peace is worth more than honor, that life is worth more than glory, that the only wind worth invoking is the one that prevents war rather than perpetuating it. Rest well, and remember, if you found this history meaningful, please subscribe to Sleepable History for more stories told with care, depth, and respect for the complexity of human experience.